we have two concepts that both need to be defined and clarified as they inspire different understandings and interpretation, depending on the perspective, the geographical location, and methodology used to address them. For instance, the definition of Afrofuturism is strongly linked to the Black American experience. It is a cultural aesthetic philosophy of science and history that explore the interaction of the African diaspora culture with science and technology in all fields of creation, music, writing, cinema, painting, fashion, etc. As an intersection of imagination, technology, and future, Afrofuturism takes representation of the life of realities of Black people in the past and present, re-examine their narratives to attempt to build new truth outside of the dominant cultural narratives. Some thinker and creators from the African continent prefer using the concept of African futurism, which they define as a more optimistic vision of the future that is directly rooted in African culture, history, mythology, and point of view, and that does not privilege the West. It is the particularity is to center on African indigenous cosmogonies, spiritualities, mystics, and imaginary. Indeed, these two movements of creation and anticipation have some different, but they share a lot of similarities and should be seen as part of the global Africa contribution to humanity. Both notions of Afrofuturism and African contemporary creation are to be addressed in the context of the debate about the construction on an African modernity. It is a debate which attempts to understand the dynamic between tradition, modernity, and contemporaneity, and to redefine the very notion of endogeneity and indigeneity. I hope that our session will offer us an opportunity to discuss how the creativity and innovation of Afrofuturism and African contemporary creation could help contribute to the building of an autonomous, epistemological, conceptual, and creative frameworks based on Africa and African diaspora indigenous experience and knowledge. So allow me now to present you our speaker and our trade discussion who will provide us a food for thought on these very complex issues. So I will present Mr. Onyekasi Wambu. He is currently the executive director at AFOD, a charity that seeks to enhance the contribution that Africans in the diaspora make to Africa's development. Since 1990, he has also taken a leadership role on issue of African cultural heritage, especially focusing on the impact of slavery and colonialism, advocating on this issue in the UK and internationally. This includes supporting the late Member of Parliament, Bernie Grant, chair of the African Reparation Movement on African and cultural issue. Mr. Wambu has founded African Remembrance Day in 1995 to commemorate the victims of slavery. He currently coordinates a forced return of the ICON program for restitution of human remains and looted African artifacts in Western cultural institutions. Our three discussion, let me first present Professor Julian Chambliss. He is a professor of English and the Val Berryman Curator of History in the museum and MCU Museum at Michigan State University. In addition, he is a co-director for the Department of English, Digital Humanities and Literary Cohesion Lab, faculty lead for the Department of English Graphic Possibility Research Workshop, and a core participant in the MSU College of Arts and Letters Consortium for Critical Diversity in Digital Age Research. His research interests focus on race, culture, and power in real and imagined spaces. His recent writing has appeared in American Historical Review, Phylon, Frieze Magazine, Rhetoric Review, and Boston Review. An interdisciplinary scholar, he has designed museum exhibitions, curated art shows, and created public history projects that trace community, ideology, and power in the United States. I would like now also to present Dr. Professor Salim Faraji. Salim is a professor and former chair of Africana Studies at California State University. He is also the founding executive director of the Master of Art in International Studies Africa program at Concordia University, Irvine in Ghana. He is a member of the International Society for Nubian Studies and specializes in early Christian history, Africana and Africanist historiography, and Coptic studies. Dr. Franji is also a founding member of the William Leon Hanspool Society and a member of the American Sudanese Archaeological Research Center. He is one of a handful of Nubiologists in the United States and a Coptic studies specialist. He also presents a ministerial background and has served in the United Methodist and Unitarian Universalist churches. Finally, we will have a very Reverend Kofi Amowetek, for whom I have not get enough information and detail about his bio, but he is a founder and director at African Gateway Mission. He holds a PhD in international study at Asbury Theological Seminary. So let me now perhaps very quickly present myself. And I think I am Ali Musa Iye. I am the director and founder of a think tank called Afrospective. Before that, I used to be the head of the Department of History and Memory for Dialogue at UNESCO, particularly in charge of the Slave Route Project and the General History of African Project. So before beginning our session, I wish to recall a few details on the procedure to follow. The speaker will have 20 minutes to make the presentation. The discussants will have 15 minutes each to comment on his presentation. And then we will have around 20 minutes for the general discussion. So I suggested this order for the intervention. Mr. Wambu for the speaker, then Professor Shamblis, Professor Faranji, and very Reverend Kofi Amoateng. So Dr. Wambu, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for that generous introduction. Looking forward to a really important conversation, because this is a session that would allow us to talk about how we imagine the future and then also how we act on the future. And I'm going to share my screen and to show a little bit how I hope to propose to talk through the conversation. In the first give me a second, I'll just so I hope to talk about imagination and knowledge creation as a ritual practice. And again, part of what I'm trying to do here is to show that while we welcome the interventions of some of the Afrofuturism, we haven't ritualized this notion of and practice of futurism or thinking about the future and knowledge creation that we need to get to the future across our communities. And for me, this is really important. Otherwise, it becomes a hobby for a group of what I have, or some people disparagingly called sort of nerdists or you know, or geeks who are doing work on the side, and it's not being centralized in the thinking. So I start off with some example of that kind of ritualized practice, and then look at really what the, as Dr. Ali said, the responses that the Afrofuturism came up to in terms of slavery, empire, and colonialism, and their responses to the Enlightenment and the scientific method. And then I look at Afrofuturism and its discontents, not too deeply. I think Dr. Ali has mentioned some of the tensions that are there between the diaspora and the continent. I look at some of the dangers for that if we are interested in a Pan-African project, and if we can't be on the same page in terms of how we see the future and who defines that future and the movements that do that, then there are obvious issues for the diaspora itself. And then I argue for a way of connecting Afrofuturism with the African knowledge systems and from the past, and look at two examples where those knowledge systems were, I think, ritualized and formed the basis of progress. It was also how ideas of myth and others were involved in that, but there was a scientific kernel inside of those African knowledge systems that we need to recover and have a conversation with, as well as the conversation with the modernism that comes out of the Enlightenment. So that's how I wish to proceed. It's long. I hope you can indulge me, but I think I can bring it in under 20 minutes. So Igbo communal greeting, the community that I come from, appeals to the eternal imagination to create new realities. Our people, the speaker says when they first addressed the community assembly, let us think it, so that we can speak it, that we can do it, so that we can contemplate what we have created. In the first place, the call was to encourage positivity and constructive thinking in the subsequent deliberations that followed the opening greeting. But the Igbo had, of course, developed and ritualized their own dialectical process of thinking and creativity. So the contemplation at the end of the creative process from the initial thinking gives way to a new iterative thinking and doing, and a new higher level of contemplation at the end of that process, and a rethinking again of the newly created. We engage here in a circular process which constantly leads to new innovation, or constantly demands new innovation and forward incremental creation, a kind of circular motion and iterative progress and invention of the future, so to speak. This process of creation was taking place within a sovereign community, still a universe unto itself, and in total control of its own unencumbered imagination and aesthetic preferences, as well as technological systems and processes for converting those thoughts into reality. As my Igbo community greeting would suggest, a high philosophical concept had been ritualized into simple everyday praxis for inventing and actualizing the future, which the community itself could be challenged to take on board. So let us think it, let us speak it, let us do it, and then let us contemplate what we've done. A profound breach, however, occurred with the forceful inclusion of this Igbo world into the Black Atlantic structured world that was structured and controlled by Slavian and colonial empires. and what have been the consequences of this breach. I conducted a small experiment last week ahead of this presentation, asking 5 ordinary Londoners of African descent how far in the past they were able to personally imagine themselves in history. Despite representing a small sample, mainly Christian sample, the results were nevertheless interesting. For all 5, there was a personal 3-generational journey to a great-grandparent, proving the continuing power and limitation of the oral tradition and personal testimony in transmitting knowledge, and the way that it disappears after only a few generations. Beyond that, they repeated general national stories of what was going on in their corner of the Atlantic world during the last 500 years. And beyond that, the furthest back that they could get was through an Abrahamic religious story idea to the birth of and the peopling of the world. When pushed by me, the religious story was somehow eventually and messily reconciled with other scientific ideas floating around about human evolution, and then they identify themselves as perhaps descendants of the first humans on the East African plains. But this was all fuzzy and generally poorly thought out. No story emerged of how the wandering East Africans became the basis for their own particular modern language, culture, or national ethnic groups, whether from the continent or in the diaspora. Asking about the future was even more interesting. Those with children imagined descendants 2 or 3 generations into the future, grandchildren and great-grandchildren towards the end of the century. And then general stories beyond that about space travel to other planets, mainly from films or other popular culture. And then when pressed, you got these apocalyptic end-time visions of the dystopias from religious from religious extology. Not one produced an upbeat, positive vision of their country of heritage or what it might look like in the future. No utopian visions. Instead, we had empty spaces. There be dragons again, but from us this time, unfortunately. So despite the AU's own global secular 2063 vision of the Africa that we want, linked to a 6th diaspora region, the practical and essential need for the kinds of engagements and interventions that Afrofuturists have been trying to provoke to tackle the breach became immediately apparent. How can we use creativity to remove ourselves from the prisons of the past and the limited visions of the future, to once more reclaim our own bodies, moving through time, unencumbered by the control of others, but powered by our own imagination? That seemed to me to be the task that the Afrofuturists were set themselves. So the movements were trying to address the issues of time and space itself and the role of the human imagination and creativity to manifest new worlds out of nothing, sometimes within that unfolding process. As I noted, the imprisonment of the imagination since the brutal formation of the Black Atlantic has been profound, as have the strategies and techniques which have been developed to describe the imprisonment of the process and how to transcend it. Artistic interventions and movements in music, literature, art, film, popular culture from within the Black Atlantic have been at the core of the strategy, from the folkloric and popular, especially as the writer Jan Carew asserts, the fantastic refashioning of a sun deity, Anansi, into a predominantly conquering trickster super spider to outwit the slaving powers. to Du Bois' own concept of double consciousness at the dawn of the 20th century, which other leading diasporic critics such as Paul Gilroy have embraced as a situational superpower, enabling overloaded, deep-sighted knowledge and knowledgeable guerrilla ambushes. To the space-bound and neo-retro 60s and 70s musical interventions of Sun Ra, Parliament, Funkadelic, and Earth, Wind and Fire. To the novels of Samuel Delany and Octavia Butler, especially the novels featuring imagined alternative colonist histories or dystopian, utopian planetary projects, to the arts of Basque, to the more recent musicians such as Janelle Monáe, who are exploring themes of slavery and freedom through the prisms of science, technology, and fashion again. And then finally, to the interventions in the comic, gaming, and filmmaking world, many of which have come together in Rai Coulter's hugely successful Black Panther set in Marvel Comics on colonizing technologically advanced country of Wakanda. But these are huge themes, different disciplines, different concerns, pulling together a vast range of work and forms. The term Afrofuturism, ironically coined by a white cultural critic, Mike Derry, in his 1993 essay, Black to the Future, attempted to pull together all speculative fiction that treats African-American themes and addresses African-American concerns in the context of 20th century technoculture. And more generally, African-American signification that appropriates images of technology and prosthetically enhanced future, and a prosthetically enhanced future. Yitzhak Lomack, writer of Afrofuturism, the world of Black science fiction and fantasy culture, defines Afrofuturism as an intersection of imagination, technology, the future, and liberation. And I would add via a diasporic prism. The diasporic prism and starting point has, of course, as Dr. Ali mentioned, produced some pushback. Jokingly, I've heard people often refer to the Afrofuturism bag as the nerd space for all those who couldn't deal with mainstream Black cultural output. They were the ones who at school loved rock music or read science fiction novels as opposed to what everybody else was doing in terms of music, reggae or soul or more traditional and acceptable Black music. There were also those artists who admitted being geeks, but who nevertheless felt that Afrofuturism did not fully reflect or capture the work that they were doing or trying to do. Well-known Nigerian-American speculative writer Nnedi Okorafor controversially described herself as an African futurist and an African jujuist. African futurism, she says, is a subcategory of science fiction. African jujuism is a subcategory of fantasy that respectively acknowledges the seamless blend of true existing African spiritualities and cosmologies with the imaginative. Its default is non-Western. Its default center is African. It's less concerned with what could have been and more concerned with what is and can be. It acknowledges, grapples, and carries what has been. She expands further that if, with Afrofuturism, Wakanda builds its first outpost in Oakland, in the US, whereas with African futurism, if Wakanda was to build its first outpost, it would be in a neighboring African country. And that for her is the importance of the difference. There is a tension here about legitimacy, about authenticity, about the river source and the tributary. But it seems to me that a movement that is ostensibly driven by the need to confront, understand, heal, and transcend a continental diaspora breach shouldn't be in danger of opening new ones. What are the implications for Pan-Africanism if the diaspora and the continent cannot see themselves as a common river with the same head source, or feeling comfortable in movements that aim to create one future, or a future that we can all share and participate in? British Ghanaian cultural critic Eko Oshon, The Black Fantastic, his new curated major art exhibition currently in London, currently at London's Hayward Gallery, has suggested a way through. The show catalogue says that The Black Fantastic brings to life a cultural movement that conjures otherworldly visions out of everyday Black experience and beyond, looking at how speculative fictions in Black art and culture are boldly reimagining perspectives. Sorry, I'm reimagining perspectives on race, on gender, on identity, and the body in the 21st century. It transcends time and space, and it takes in myths, future fantasies, and beyond. But again, it wrestles with science. So though the Black perspective inhabits its own space, situation itself as neither Afrofuturism or African futurism or even magic realism, it remains a modernist response or a subgenre to the science and speculative fiction ecosystem that has emerged since the post-Enlightenment adoption of the scientific method. And I wanted to come in on this point really, which is to look at how all of this has been a conversation that the geeks and nerds, or those who are in this space, have been having with Western modernism, but has not involved what I would say is a structured conversation with prior African philosophical systems and the broader community. It also raises the importance of revisiting and reincorporating the older knowledgeable ways of seeing and understanding as a key vehicle for allowing the imagination once more to soar unencumbered. Especially as it might enable us to contemplate, once we've created these new realities as the Igbo conjured out from the imagination and through words, the technological and aesthetic wonders of the past. The Igbo word Ubo translates roughly as transport, or the means for transporting. When they wish to suggest which mode of transport is involved, these days an affix is simply added. So Uboala is land transport, Uboelu is aeroplane or air transport, Ubomiri is a boat or a ship. I would ask that we welcome back Ubochi, or the spirit, an African spirit ship through time. The word chi plays on the idea of a person existing simultaneously in two realms, a spiritual chi dimension and a material eke dimension, which harmonize to produce the creative force that the Igbo used to recognize as the supreme power, which is Chineke, Chi and Eke. The duality of that eternal spiritual presence of the individual and that spirit's actualization as destiny or portion in the material world. Indeed, the spirit travels through time, awaiting actualization and destiny. And that spirit constantly travels through time, awaiting actualization and destiny. Destiny can be made unproductive, it can be wasted, or it can be maximized and exalted, especially in periods we look back on as golden ages. The African ship through time can take us backwards and forwards as we choose, or through different realms or dimensions as the need requires, engaging with different African knowledge systems and different African realities. The ancient Egyptians watched the stars intensely for thousands of years. They realized that their lives depended on it. The year, in fact, was ritualized and began with the rising of the star they called Sabet, personifying the dog star, or Cyrus, as we now call it, as it coincided with the flooding of the Nile, vital for their agriculture and civilization. So they needed to understand, and as Maureen Richmond says, and develop an accurate and reliable measurement of time and its passage. And that was how they began to understand, in particular, an accurate way to, as she says, to determine the length of the year was needed. Can somebody mute themselves, please?
Yes, Abdulrahman, can you mute your mic?
So they developed a way to determine the length of the year was urgently needed if the floods of the Nile were to be reliable, predicted, and managed and capitalized. And one of the best methods they discovered was the accurate sighting of Cyrus at a certain time of year. And then what they did was to ritualize that through different parts of their culture, through the way that they understood the deities, the way that they dealt with other practices in their in their knowledge systems, and it was, that idea was transferred right throughout their systems. Cyrus was synonymous with the basic incontrovertible elements of life, the continuity of life beyond physical death, the nurturing of Mother Nature as Isis, the power of the heavenly vault in the general, and the fundamental role of light from our local star, plus the advanced knowledge necessary for accurate calculation of time periods and eons. The importance of Cyrus extended to the creation of the hierarchy of deities, as I said, to the placing of sacred architecture, as well as to funerary practices, and symbolizing the themes of death and rebirth. Time meant the long past, the present, the future, and an alternative future where you were reborn in another ancestral realm to travel the universe in a bark of light amongst the stars. So the pyramids that we see and the funerary practices of placing the pharaoh there was that are revealed in the Book of the Dead suggests that another way of thinking of them is that they were spaceships in which the returned soul of the illuminated one could then travel the stars. But this is ideas of future travel, of in different realms by different types of the human personality, ancestral, beyond the physical material. Again, our Ubochi would allow us to have that conversation, this spirit chi, as I'm calling it, and that ship of the spirit chi. Meanwhile, the Yoruba Ifa divination is based on a system of knowledge production that seeks to provide answers to the most fundamental, profound questions confronting the asker. It is a way to understand and manifest the divine will, as the Yoruba saw it. And the role of the ancestral orishas and the first time in shaping the choices of the future is obvious. The system is essentially based on the events that took place in the first days when Oludumare, the creator, made the world and then sent the orishas to create humans and fashion culture. The story of creation is captured in the different chapters and verses which are collected in the Udu Ifa. That, like other ancient models, the system assumes there's nothing new under the sun. The role of the ancestral orishas and the first time in shaping the choices of the future are simply repeated. The agency exists within the framework offered by this binary. Do you do what the first orishas did when the world was created, or do you do something else? So issues in the present are merely repetitions of events that took place in the first days, now contained in the verses of the Udu. So people seeking an answer to the problems consult the Babalawo or the priest, who will cast the cowrie shells, and depending on how they land, face up or face down, marks the binary results. Marks the binary results as an algorithm on the floor. At the end of the divination, the marks indicate the appropriate verses from the Udu Ifa, which the Babalawo will recite for the supplicant to either implement or refuse to do so, since, as we know, there is never any compulsion in religion. The Yoruba developed the idea of binary language to understand the intentions of the divine, but did not develop it further for other scientific everyday uses, such as modern computing. However, they did advance on other ancient divination systems, which relied on priests or virgins interpreting the will of the divine. In fact, this was typical of divination systems all over the world. There were people consulting oracles from Delphi or elsewhere with their problems to be told what to do once they had deposited the tithes. Similarly, the Abrahamic faiths rely on their own systems of oracles for answers. Their particular innovation was to contain their oracular response in 3 books provided by prophets and holy men who received revelations.
Mr. Ubu, will you please conclude your intervention?
I'm finishing now.
Okay.
Just give me a minute. The Yoruba innovation was to base the oracular feedback as much as possible on neutral methods of assessing the will of the divine through binary numbers rather than human interpretation. The modern computer system industry has combined binary language algorithms and the best of the past oracular systems to answer all questions that we have in our current day. These days, anybody seeking an answer to any question goes first to the new global oracular shrine, Google, which improves on the old system by providing a multiple choice of millions of answers. Again, it's down to the individual seekers which answers they wish to act on. As the Babalawo might remark, nothing ever new under the sun. So elsewhere, the communities like the Igbo have conceived time and space, including multiple dimensions that merge past, present, future, in seamless continuums of consciousness, while existing in parallel realms and worlds. These conceptions had goals that were, as we've seen, spiritual, ritualistic, political, technological, artistic, and aesthetic. Afrofuturism has not been ritualized for community action or for conversation with all those different notions of what we were trying to do. A rethinked Afrofuturism would need to excavate and introduce a real-time conversation with some of these African conceptions of time in order to reclaim a realm of uninterrupted agency and flight of the imagination aboard the Ubochi, the spirit ship. I'm going to end there, but I wanted to apologize to everybody. I've been suffering from COVID for the last 6 days. So today was the first day I tested negatively. I didn't even think I might be able to make it, but I'm here. So please indulge some of the difficulties I've been having making this presentation, but I'm glad we got to the end.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. No, really, it was a very rich presentation, and I really salute your courage to make the presentation despite the recovering from the COVID. No, really, it was a very rich presentation. You have recalled the importance of connecting Afrofuturism to the African knowledge system, and also to the different way that our society have developed to ritualize the future. And I think, and you have recalled the existence of a process of creation from the African society that have managed to ritualize the very high philosophical principle into something, into paradigm symbol that ordinary people can use and further develop. And that is really a source for inspiration for all people who are interested in the future-oriented anticipation. I like that you recall the limitation of oral tradition. So the people that you have interviewed can even go beyond the 3 generations. And I think that is a problem that we have, and we should now compensate that weaknesses of our oral tradition to keep the chronology. You have also mentioned the lack of Ethiopian vision in Africa. It's also indeed a real problem. And I think all this new movement of creators, I think, have a long work to develop an African Ethiopian visions. So thank you very much, and I hope that is a really a good food for thought for our discussion, and of course for the discussion that will comment your presentation. And now I have the pleasure to invite Professor Dorian Champlis to take the floor.
Well, thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I will try to keep my comments brief. I know in forums like this, it's often the discussion afterward that's the most engaging. I appreciate the opportunity to provide commentary and to be a discussant for such a great conference. Although I do worry, the guy from America sort of hopping in may not necessarily be the most authoritative voice that you need to hear in a situation like this. I want to start by saying that I think the primary goals of the talk are actually really core to contemporary Afrofuturist conversation, especially from an North American perspective. I'm struck by the fact that Professor Wambu talked specifically about Mark Derry. And I think one of the things that we forget, even though he's a white culturalist, white cultural theorist who coined the term, really the root of that sort of term came from a really close historical analysis. And in part, while there are many suppositions in the original essay called Black to the Future that he wrote, where he coined the term Afrofuturism, this historical analysis that he used to frame the introduction of the term actually remains very cogent to us as people who are thinking about a future where African diasporic concerns are at the center of the conversation as opposed to subjects in the fringe or marginalized by colonial power. I often talk to my students about that historical framing, in part because even though it was written in 1993, 94, that the things that he says still remain very, very real for African Americans in particular. He assumes, in the context of that conversation, that African Americans aren't involved or concerned about speculative practice, about science fiction. Obviously, almost immediately after he coined the term, a whole host of scholars emerged who offered concrete archival evidence that people of African descent in the United States and other parts of the world were deeply concerned with speculative practice. I know Sherry Renee Thomas's classic collection, Dark Matter, brought together a number of studies written by African Americans starting in the 19th century that really offered speculative practice as a tool to respond to the question of slavery, colonial oppression, and the challenges offered by people of African descent around the world. And indeed, for Afrofuturism, both to yesterday and today, is very much a question of a kind of public narrative, something I think Kojo Oshun makes clear in his great essay, Further Conversations on Afrofuturism, where he talks about Afrofuturism is a toolkit for people of African descent to respond to their existence in a kind of hostile global context. I'm paraphrasing there. That process means that Afrofuturism is not just simply an academic conversation, it's also a communal conversation. I note that what Professor is calling for in terms of like us engaging with a reconsideration of knowledge creation is really core to almost every Afrofuturist conversation that we have happening, no matter what part of the world that is in. And one of the things that many of my colleagues and myself are concerned with is, while, as he rightly points out, something like an oral tradition has its limitations, and reframing our way of production of knowledge, we have to recognize that, in fact, some of these sort of African traditions, some of these oral traditions represent an alternative framework that offers important insights and suppositions that will shape and reshape our understanding of how we got to the place that we are right now and offer important pathways to a better future. Ultimately, every Afrofuturist conversation, whether in North America, South America, Africa, or Asia, is a conversation about trying to recover those things that are lost. And as someone who thinks about Afrofuturism and works in digital humanities, it is often, I think, a project of recovery that does, in fact, do exactly what our speaker is asking us to do. Think about those things that are lost and make really hard choices about creating a system that will value, recover, and perhaps create new contexts by which new knowledge can be created and new systems can be implemented. For us as Afrofuturists in the North American context, Africa is always a part of the conversation. That conversation has been going on for more than 200 years. Indeed, one of the things about Afrofuturism from the sort of North American, Black American perspective is this fascination with Africa. At its heart, that is the thing that we have lost. In our hearts, that is the thing that we seek to recover. So there's always a question of the pathways available to us to be a part of that conversation. I know that in contemporary Afrofuturist dialogues and writings, theorists like Ronaldo Anderson, who wrote a book, co-edited a book called Afrofuturism 2.0, really make the argument that the contemporary Afrofuturist movement is a global movement that differs from earlier emanations of Afrofuturism, in part because the people have technology to connect them, that we in fact are in conversation with our fellows around the world who are part of the diaspora in a way that has not been possible in previous moments. And indeed, this conference perhaps exemplifies the point that he's making. As a result, the nature of the Afrofuturist dialogues that can be created in these contexts have important and powerful implications. The idea that this is not simply a scholarly conversation, but a communal conversation that might have impacts across the different spheres of practice, be it politics, social practice, economic practice, are very important. For many contemporary Afrofuturists, the thought that they will be able to create a system that operates outside of or parallel to the sort of dominant European system and its colonial legacies is a primary goal. And we can see a set of activities in different fields championed by people of African descent that are aiming towards that. The hard problem or the hard choices are about what of those many ideas are going to be delivered in terms of actionable action. And I think that is really one of the primary debates amongst Afrofuturists right now. Obviously, from a North American perspective, understanding the context of the problems that we have from our perspective don't always completely align with the concerns of people and our fellows in other parts of the world. And being able to dialogue about creating a system that's more equitable and allowing for a set of practices that formulate a more freer future and take into account some of the legacies, both negative and positive, of the past is really a core debate. And I think it's not hard for anyone who's keyed into the Afrofuturist conversation to understand that. And I would argue at some level this definitional debate between an Afrofuturism versus African futurism is rooted in those kinds of concerns. So ultimately, I think one of the things that the presentation calls our attention is there is a tradition of trying to recover at the core of Afrofuturism. And the real question isn't whether or not Africa will be a part of that. It's really a question of how that African conversation, that African solution will play on the global stage. And I'll stop there. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Professor Julian Chambliss. I think you provide us a more clear, perspective from the North American perspective of how the Afrofuturism is understood. And I liked the fact that you compare it to a toolkit to really help to respond to the challenge faced by the Black people living in a hostile context in the Americas. And also you mentioned that the Afrofuturists in North America are in a certain way obsessed by Africa. So, and paradoxically, you want through the Afrofuturism to recover the past that was lost. And it's very interesting to see the future, to go behind, to run behind the past, to recreate the past. And I think that is really very, very important contribution to the debate. And I agree with you that we should not lose that much time in opposing Afrofuturism to the African futurism. That is, I think, an intellectual thing. And the fact is now the challenge is how this debate can come to the communities and inspire all the actions, the activities, the movement of the people, for the emancipation and liberation from the narrative. So I think, thank you very much for that. And now I would like to give the floor to Professor Salim.
Please mute yourself, please. Please mute yourself.
Yeah. So I would like to give the floor to Professor Francis and now to comment on the comment and the presentation that we just heard. The floor is yours.
Your call has been forwarded to an automated voice messaging system. 757240348 is not available. At the tone, please record your message. When you finish recording, you may hang up or press 1 for more options.
Hi, this message is for Samantha. This is Ms. Marsha, Virginia Premier Health. My number is 800-727-7536, extension 54479. Will you give me a call at your earliest?
So I'm sorry, am I the next presenter? I'm not sure.
Yes, you're the next presenter.
Okay, all right.
Yes.
Okay, all right. I'm going to share my screen. Let me say good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Here in the Los Angeles metropolitan area, it's about 9:17 a.m. I'm so pleased to finally meet you all and join you all. I'm Dr. Salim Faraji. I'm a professor of Africana Studies at California State University, Dominguez Hills in the Los Angeles metropolitan area. I just want to pull my screen. All right. All right. So everyone can see this, of course. My perspective, I'm not as I guess rooted theoretically in the tradition of Afrofuturism and Black speculative thought, and even science fiction and the imaginative and fantastic spheres. But I am very concerned with the themes and the ideas and the propositions for the future and the synthesis of science and art and technology and creativity that we see in Afrofuturism. Not only that, I'm also a religion and theological scholar. I'm a historian, but I'm also a religion and theological scholar. And so I've been initiated in a Conf traditional spirituality from Ghana, West Africa. And Dr. Wambu also talked about ancient Egyptian myth and cosmology and philosophy. And I'm certainly very steeped in those practices as well. And so, and then not only that, just my overall commitment and passion to connect Afrofuturism to development. And so, you know, one of the things that I've noticed is that what we call Afrofuturism is already in existence in both the African continent and the African diaspora. In our stories, in our traditions, in our folklore, in our cultural practices, our culinary practices, our medicinal practices, our funerary practices, our rites of passage, and so forth. Not only that, also in our religious and sacred worldviews as well. So I'm going to draw on some of that as we proceed. I want to begin with someone who's considered, you know, one of the preeminent scholars of our generation in African studies, Dr. Toyin Falola. He offers some insight, I believe, in definitions of how he defines African futurism. For me, Afrofuturism and African futurism are synonymous. I understand geographical distinctions. I understand the cultural distinctions between the African continent and North America. And even not only that, but even the Caribbean, Europe, and even the South Pacific, wherever people of African descent are. And I honor those demarcations. But for me, I assert that, you know, what African people of African descent, what we imagine, what we fathom, what we create in terms of postulating a future, especially in regards to development, and not only that, liberation, freedom, and sovereignty is what binds us, right? So my vision is more Pan-African, it's more Africana and global and so forth. Just understanding these various schools of thought as just that, schools of thought within an overall Africana or Pan-Africanist tradition. And so of course, some of these things have already been talked about. This book explores how decolonization and decoloniality provides liberationist knowledge to question and replace the hegemony of Western knowledge systems imposed on Africa. It critically examines the silencing and exclusion of subalterns in global knowledge production and the far-reaching implications of this for pedagogy and policy as global power is concentrated in the global north, where Eurocentrists and white supremacy validate the monopoly of knowledge and its centrality and universality. African perspectives, and again, for me, that includes the diaspora as well as the continent, continue to be marginalized or excluded in research, creating the problem of misrepresentation of the continent. It is this challenge that the book has responded, the urgent need to eliminate the vestiges of colonialism in the academy and research methodologies and so forth. So we see this project This project, of course, which is very common, this project of decolonizing African studies, decolonizing African knowledge production. Of course, here in the United States, you know, one can think of Carter G. Woodson, his classic work. He's considered the father of, or the progenitor, if you will, quote unquote, of African-American history, 1875, 1950, second African-American, get his PhD from Harvard University after W.B. Du Bois, founded the Journal of Negro History, founded the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, and is also the founder of what is now Black History Month, which was Black History Week in 1926. His whole idea of the miseducation of the Negro is a decolonizing project. So this idea of decolonizing certainly is rooted in the African continent, but it is also rooted in the diasporic context, and in particular the U.S. African diaspora. You know, and in the opening sentence of Carter G. Woodson's book, The Miseducation of the Negro, he says, the educated African. This is a language that he uses in 1926. Carter G. Woodson, the educated African has been taught to admire the Hebrew, admire the Greek, the Latin, and the Teuton, and despise the African, right? This is the first sentence in the book, The Miseducation of the Negro. So my idea, so my proposal is this idea of decolonizing African knowledge production, decolonizing the shackles, so to speak, on African mind, African mentality that we see here with Dr. Toyin Falola is a common theme, as others have indicated, that goes back centuries. And so it's in this context, if you will, to assert the agency, to assert the humanity of African people, to put forth a vision for the future. And not only that, practical steps for the present. So Professor Falola offers a definition. It's a definition that I'm drawn to. African futurism, he says, seen as the advanced stage of decoloniality, African futurism involves the application of traditional indigenous instruments of articulation and cohesion, such as Afro-spirituality. So we've already heard about Igbo and Yoruba and ancient Egypt or ancient Kemet and so forth. Afro-spirituality, myth, folklore, and indigenous techno-scientific innovations deployed in their capacity to drive, harness, and actualize future possibilities, right? And the reason why I'm drawn to this definition is that I'm you know, much of my training is in history, and I'm an Africanist. I'm also a nubiologist, so I study ancient African civilizations, and then of course my interest in living African spirituality, whether it be Santeria, Vodun, Candomblé, African American folk traditions, or even the Akan tradition in Ghana, Igbo, Yoruba, Serer, Wolof, and Senegambia, so forth. The Zulu, whatever these traditions are. What I've discovered is that the future possibilities are already rooted in our cultural practices, in our cultural traditions. Could you please silence yourself? We're hearing some noise background. There's some noise background. Please mute yourself.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So future possibilities are already rooted in the indigenous knowledge productions of African people globally. And so our responsibility is to revisit these traditions, right, in the spirit of scientific innovation, ingenuity, and so forth. And so here's a definition. Afrofuturism also suggests beyond the imaginative and fantastic sphere, a re-engagement of African indigenous knowledge via innovative technologies, and science, STEM fields. Afrofuturism is the advancement of scientific indigeneity, right? And what I mean by scientific indigeneity is looking at indigenous African knowledge production. So for me, that's the US diaspora, that's Jamaica, that's the Caribbean, that's Brazil. Certainly it's the African continent, it's the South Pacific, right? Revisiting our indigenous knowledge from the perspective of the natural sciences, from the perspective of STEM and so forth. And I've given some examples and illustrations as we proceed and so forth, right? It's rich. We haven't even begun to scratch the surface of the visionary and futuristic and scientific possibilities and capabilities of African indigenous knowledge production, in part, as we all know, because of the legacies of slavery, the legacies of colonialism, the legacies of vilifying and demonizing and marginalizing African knowledge as quote unquote primitive, quote unquote tribal, quote unquote backwards, quote unquote underdeveloped, or in the US diaspora context, simply a Black replica of standard Euro-American practice, as opposed to viewing it as its own indigenous practice and so forth. And so for me, we have a long way to go in that regard, in terms of basically taking ourselves seriously, taking our thought seriously to pioneer possibilities for the future. Here are two works for me by the late Shekinta Diop. Of course, not only was he a linguist, not only was he a philologist, not only was he an Egyptologist and a political theorist, right? We often forget that Diop was also a physicist, right? Which for me is, his legacy is amazing, that he was able to do Egyptology, history, linguistics, political theory, right? And he was also a scientist, and he was very self-conscious about what that meant. So in the at the end of his classic work, Civilization or Barbarism, he has a conversation that to me points to Afrofuturism. He doesn't use the word Afrofuturism, but he talks about physics, parapsychology, and the future of African philosophy, right? And so he gives a statement about not only African humanity, but where all humanity must go, right? To live in a world that's equitable and egalitarian and so forth. And then certainly his work, Black Africa, the Economic and Cultural Basis for a Federated State, which is a brilliant treatise on the future of African development. Trade, transportation, energy, agriculture, right? All the various sectors, right? He lays out in his assessment, his opinion, an idea of what that could look like. Not only an idea, but what needs to happen. And so one of the things that I also looked at is that in the book Black Africa, he lays out what he calls an energy doctrine for the entire African continent, drawing on the solar energy capabilities of the Sahara, the geothermal capabilities in the Horn of Africa, especially Ethiopia and the surrounding East African nations, and the hydraulic or hydroelectric capabilities in the Congo River Basin and the Congo rainforest, right? Diop is having this conversation in 1974, which for me is incredibly futuristic, right? And of course, he gives this classic statement that unless we deal with the energy issue on the African continent, we're playing games. In the beginning, Diop says, in the beginning is energy. All else flows therefrom. So here's a quote from the book Black Africa. To the left, Diop says, generally speaking, all of East Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and the entire Rift Valley region would be eminently suited for the installation of plants powered by geothermal energy. These are all the energy resources of Black Africa, their utilization by Africans themselves, not to create industries to supplement those of Europe, but to process the raw materials that the continent contains, could turn Black Africa into a paradise on earth, 1974, right? This is checking job. Here's an article. Reuters. This also went to other media outlets. February 2018, Addis Ababa gets $4 billion investment for leap into geothermal power. Ethiopia has signed a preliminary agreement with a US-based and Icelandic, right? Iceland has been on the cutting edge of geothermal power, energy firm for $4 billion private sector investment intending to tap into its vast geothermal power resources and help it become a major exporter of energy for East Africa. An exporter to who? Is the question, right? So these external investors are developing geothermal capacity in Ethiopia, the Horn of Africa, something that Diop said the continent needed to do in 1974, but is being done, but it's not being done necessarily, right, on a continental wide scale, and nor is it directed to all African people either. The Reykjavik geothermal, whose Icelandic geothermal expertise is backed by US investors, signed a deal with Ethiopia on Wednesday to construct a 1,000 megawatt geothermal power plant, Africa's largest in the volcanically active Rift Valley. Again, I only gave an excerpt in a quote of Diop in Black. Yes?
Yes. Dr.
Okay.
Salim, you have few minutes to conclude.
Okay, well, let me, just indulge me, bear with me for a minute, right? Here's another conversation that he has at the end of Civilization and Barbarism.
Please.
Excuse me. Here, he's talking about quantum mechanics. This is Afrofuturism. Quantum mechanics is on the verge of negating the local physical causality of classical physics in order to admit the possibility of instantaneous interactions on the scale of the dimensions of the universe. The properties of physics revealed by quantum mechanics and by relativity make possible and thinkable the parapsychological phenomena of vision or action from a distance. Thus, modern physics has created the right situation to teach us that classic logic is nothing but the sum of our mental habits and provisional rules, which can be changed through sovereign consciousness, right? And sovereign experience, right? Tomorrow, sovereign experience will be able to transform into rational fact, which seems to us logically absurd or impossible. So in other words, he's arguing, which is something that African philosophy, whether it's the Shona and Ndebele in Zimbabwe, or whether it's the Shuluk, the Noor, the Dinka in South Sudan, wherever, all throughout the African continent, there's a metaphysic in African culture that presupposes that the human being and phenomena are non-local, right? We're actually transdimensional beings, as what Dr. Wambu said when he talked about Chi and Eke, right? Chike, right? We're both, right? And so he's saying that where we need to go is to operate out of this framework. These are just examples. This is Father Alsa Mandando, who's in Nigeria, cutting edge. What is he doing? He's scientifically revisiting traditional medicine in Nigeria. Right? Embracing traditional medicine in Nigeria through scientific indigeneity. Right? Because my time is short, I'm going to keep it moving. But he's on the ground in Nigeria doing this type of work, right? And he said the struggle he had to deal with is the idea that African medicine is witchcraft, is juju, is fetish, is evil, right? He had to push past those barriers in the people's mind, colonized thinking, miseducation, right? In order for them to revisit the traditional medicine in Nigeria from a scientific perspective, right? And use it, because there's no way in the world that modern allopathic medical facilities cannot meet the health demand of Nigerians. And that's the case for many nations on the continent, right? Here's another example. Here's Dr. Thibe Mudupe, president of the African Astronomical Society. He's from the San people, of Southern Africa. He said he was inspired to get into astronomy and physics by San folklore, the so-called Bushmen, right? You know, in Western ethnography, Western anthropology, the San people are called the Bushmen, right? Yet within their folklore, within their cosmological, astronomical myths, has the possibility to chart a new future, which is what this scholar, this man has done in South Africa. And not only has he tapped into the astronomical knowledge of his own people, the San people, but also in Timbuktu in West Africa, Nabta Playa in Sudan and Egypt, and other places as well. And then here we have Okomfo. Okomfo is traditional priests or mediums in the Akan culture of Ghana, West Africa. There's a video that I use with my students because I teach African religions here at Cal State Dominguez. I've also taught it for seminary students as well, preparing for ministry, for them to understand African spirituality. In the video, Okomfo, Dancers of the Gods, there's a scene where they're at a shrine in Mampong, right? Small town or village in the eastern region in Ghana. And the shrine worker says, he says, look, when you enter into the shrine, it's fourth dimensional. It's fourth dimension. It's not, you're no longer in the three-dimensional world. And what looks like magic in the three-dimensional world, in the shrine, is common sense, right? And so I'm looking at this video, and I share with my students, how is this man, a shrine worker in the eastern region in Ghana, for the Conf, right? Where there's ambivalent attitudes, they're respected as traditional healers and leaders, but at the same time, there's also this idea that, you know, they're fetish and they're witch doctors and so forth, right? So this ambivalent understanding of them. But I'm like, how is this man talking about the shrine is in fourth dimension, right? The metaphysics of the shrine, it's not based on, let's go back to Shekinah Diop, it's not based on classical physics. It's based on quantum physics, an understanding of the human being and phenomena as non-local, right? And so my point is that the culture is rich. It needs to be revisited from the perspective of science, which I call scientific indigeneity. Of the water and the spirit, may he rest in peace. Maladomo So may he just passed. He tells a story in the beginning of his book, how he took an episode of Star Trek, right? And I saw Dr. Chamblis had the Star Trek background on his Zoom image, right? He says he took, this is Burkina Faso, he took an episode of Star Trek to his people in Burkina Faso when he returned home from studying in the US, right? And he said his people did not see it as science fiction. They did not see it as futuristic. They saw it as common everyday life. He said their only problem is that teleportation should have been done more discreetly. Right? This is what he says his people said about Star Trek. Like, why are they doing teleportation out in the open like that? Right? Other than that, so he says, isn't it something that these so-called primitive people of West Africa do not view America's vision of science fiction as futuristic? They view it as normal and a part of everyday life, right? And so my point this afternoon, this morning, this evening, is that through scientific indigeneity, revisiting African indigenous knowledge and culture, not only on the continent, but even where I'm in the US diaspora, Caribbean and so forth, right? It is rich for what we can uncover and what we can harness, not only in spirituality, but I also showed you in energy as well, right? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your really fantastic presentation, completing, enriching our understanding of Afrofuturism and bringing the importance of the scientific innovation to be there. And this issue of the fourth dimension that all African traditional culture have already integrated in their beliefs and spirituality, and that is now discovered by the science. The science is very, very interesting, and I don't continue to comment on your intervention because I would like to give a little bit space. Although we are a little bit late on time, I would like to give opportunity for some discussion with the participants. So please, the floor is open. Is there any comment, any question about not only the presentation of the speaker, but also the presentation of the discussants? Please raise your hand if you are in. No, I think it is the end of the day. And maybe everybody is a little bit tired, but really the inspiring presentation that we had this afternoon is really very important to reconsider our understanding of the Afrofuturism and or African futurism. And I think a lot of issues about the indigenous knowledge or endogenous knowledge system has been raised. And I think that this definition, in a center way, I agree that Afrofuturism and African futurism are really very similar in as you said, Professor Salim. And I think this is for the development of Africa, it is an important concept and paradigm that we have to develop further and to integrate into all our reflection, into all our conceptualization of the very notion of when we talk about the cultural heritage, when we talk about science, when we talk about progress, we should have in mind all this notion that has been developed today. So is there any question? Yes, I see in the room, I see, but I would give the floor first to the lady.
No.
Oh, sure.
I was just, yeah.
Okay, all right. So go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks very much, Dr. Faraji. Yeah, the question is, how can Africa and the diaspora work together to claim the rightful place of indigenous knowledge system? Because we know that there's a lot of work. We saw the slides from Dr. Faraji, medicine, energy, agriculture, education, and these are rightful knowledge systems which can stand on their own. They've been used a long time ago. So we realize there's a need to reclaim the rightful place of indigenous knowledge system. On the other hand, in the diaspora, we've got many achievements of people of African origin who have been responsible for many inventions which are not known. The question is, if you look at the suppression of indigenous knowledge, for example, calling traditional medicine or traditional areas witches, or trying to, these were the machinations of the missionaries to discourage people from going to traditional areas. They wanted them to go to the hospital they established, or they called religions worshiping spirits which were considered bad because they wanted people to go to churches. So we know who is responsible for the suppression of the culture. People living in the diaspora are living with those people responsible for destroying our culture. So what practical ways can be taken to make sure that indigenous knowledge systems are given their rightful place? We have UN resolutions, UNESCO is a great support of IKS and so on. But how can we put those into action and move from just talking? We know the problem is, we know what we need to do, but how can we work together to make things happen? Thank you.
You know, there's an actor here in the U.S. Originally from Benin. You all may know Jaimon Hunsu, right? Famous actor. He played in Amistad, you know, some 20 years ago, that classic film, right? He has a video. He did a video. I believe it's on Netflix or it may be on Amazon Prime, if I'm not mistaken, one of those two. He has a video on the history and culture of voodoo in Benin, right? And he talks about his experiences growing up as a child in traditional Benin culture of voodoo, right? It's a beautiful, well done video. He's the commentator and the lead producer on the video and so forth, right? And at the end of the video, he's interviewing professors, and what he says is, he says, in Africa and even the diaspora, we need chairs, academic chairs, right? Scholars to institutionalize our knowledge, right? So he said we need a chair of voodoo at this practice in Benin and maybe even in Haiti, right? Chairs of African indigenous knowledge, African traditional religions at our universities, right? To teach the tradition and perspective also from the vantage point of the sciences. So let's look at Father Anselm Adodo in Nigeria, right? He is looking at traditional medicine from the perspective of pharmacology, from the perspective of chemistry, from the perspective of biology and so forth, right? That's one dimension, right? Let's look at the mining sector on the African continent, right? Which is one of the #1 extractive sectors on the African continent, maybe second to oil and gas and so forth, right? And so we need people trained in the geological sciences, need people trained in engineering and so forth, right? We have the knowledge in our towns and villages. We have the knowledge in our cities here in the US, right? But have we institutionalized it? Have we taken ourselves seriously enough to say we're going to approach our own knowledge, our own practices, right? And study it, right? Scientifically and methodically to create the Africa we want, to create the diaspora we want, to create the planet that we want and so forth, right? And so one of the things that I'm involved in is we're a nonprofit organization here in Southern California. It's called the Amen-Ra Community Assembly of California, the Amen-Ra Theological Seminary, right? And our focus is to focus, I'm sorry for being redundant, our focus is to highlight African indigenous knowledge, African traditional religions, the continent and the diaspora, right? And not only to study it, but to train people in it as practitioners, right? And again, not only to be ministers or priests, which is nothing wrong with that. I'm a priest, I'm a minister, right? But also from the perspective of the natural sciences and STEM, which is one of the reasons why I showed the example of geothermal energy in the Horn of Africa. But it's not only in the Horn of Africa, right? It's the Sahara, the Congo River Basin, the Nile River Basin, right? Even West Africa, the Volta River Basin and the Barine Belt, right? And the stuff that's going on right now there, right? All of this takes scientific ingenuity. And so for me, we have to take ourselves serious enough to institutionalize, right, our knowledge and study it from the perspective of science, which, you know, for me, I call scientific indigeneity, right? Lift the indigenous knowledge from the colonial realm of primitive and backwards and fetish and witchcraft and juju and bush knowledge, you know, all the derogatory terms we associate, right? Or here in the US, oh, you know, you all are hood, you're gangster, right? You know, all of these derogatory terms. No, let's take it out of those colonial slave categories and let's privilege our own knowledge and let's run with it from the perspective of science, right? And let's institutionalize it. That's number one. And also teach our children and youth as well so they can get a head start.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask Dr. Wambu, if you want to add something, and Dr. Champlis, if you have some last thought and comment on the discussion we had. So perhaps Dr. Wambu.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, very interesting and provocative contribution thoughts that have been passed on that have, I think, really brought us to quite a rich conversation. The one thing I wanted to add was just two things. Two things. The thing I wanted to add was a response to some points that had been made by others who were responding to my presentation. The first was that I wasn't making a deal about Mark Duray, who coined the term Afrofuturism. It was just to note that he was white. It wasn't it wasn't being, it wasn't supposed to be a something that was critical or anything else. It was just simply to know that actually the term had been coined by a white person. The second point was that I wanted to just separate, and I don't think perhaps I made it clear enough, that the space that I was really interested in was a space of praxis. I think there's a lot of indigenous knowledge, there's a lot of but then what is that the praxis for being able to do, for moving from imagination to developing the technology that you need to develop. There must have been Igbo people who 2,000 years ago said, okay, we can fly. And indeed, some of the Igbo communities who went across the Atlantic as part of that period of enslavement, they were all their myths and folk tales in African American and other Caribbean communities where people imagined that when they died or even when they were alive, they could fly back to Africa. So there's ideas about flight and how you do this and everything else, but how do you actually move from that idea of flying to creating the planes that we I think was mentioned earlier on today. There's still not a direct flight between Suriname or Ghana, and people were complaining about still having to travel through Europe. How do we create the plane and move from that kind of mythic and that realm of speculation and that fourth or third dimension that I think Brother Salim mentioned in Burkina Faso to the realm of creativity. And how do we, as I said, how do we ritualize that so that it becomes an everyday occurrence and not just a conversation amongst intellectuals? I think that it's that space that I'm really, really interested in. The African imagination is endless, but how, and again, I think Brother Salim mentioned, again, for me, the important thing is how do you merge that dual aspect of the imagination, the spirit, and then how does that spirit land and is operationalized in terms of the destiny, the Eke part of it, the tree and the Eke. So I just wanted to punch that home again, because I think for me, that's the sweet spot. There's nobody can tell us that we can't think or we can't imagine or everything else. But the question is, how do we then land the imagination? How do we, as Brother Salim said, how do we institutionalize these ideas so that they become also material output? I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wambu. And now I would like to give the floor to Julian Champlis, Professor Julian Champlis.
Yeah, thank you. I agree that the question of institutionalization of sort of indigenous knowledge or local knowledge, community knowledge, whatever term we want to use, is really a key element of Afrofuturism. I think the pathway to doing that often leads through educational institutions, the role of them as repositories of information, and through those repositories, by focusing on community, they legitimize through institutionalization, which is a complicated exercise. I think our challenge here is always to provide the space to allow sort of community knowledge to be recognized as knowledge. And then once recognized as knowledge, institutionalized, and then can be built upon in a way that affects the system and its future operations. For a lot of Afrofuturist scholars, I think this is in part why the idea of recovery, be it oral history or community studies or artifacts, are so important, because they're the benchmarks that are used to create the new conversations about the system. The challenge for us all, I think at some level, is because we're members of institutions. Those institutions have complicated backgrounds. How do you have the kind of practice that allows the community to, quite frankly, feel safe in those spaces when they're engaged in that work? And that really is a variety of different kinds of techniques, but that's, I think, at the core of how what we've all sort of alluded to in our own way, the transformation of the institutional machine. So I'll leave it at that. And again, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Julian. And I think we are coming up to the end of our session. As a conclusion, I can only say that we are witnessing today an increasing, development of a movement, I can say, which is really now keen of developing, revisiting, exploring our indigenous system of knowledge and practices in all the different area, in medicine, in governance, in art. And I think, yes, we need to institutionalize that movement. Yes, we need to have a space, a place. And really here I'm addressing to our friends of the Pan-African Museum. This might be a place where all these people involved in the exploring of our indigenous system can come, exchange. And I think we need to have that kind of places, but in Africa, because so far, unfortunately, the knowledge production always happening outside Africa. And I think it's time now, and this is part of also of the indigenization movement, that the space of production of this kind of knowledge be also in Africa. And I think here, this is a call for all the African universities, African Research Center to host that kind of conversation and exchange. So I think this is work in progress. This is a process, and I really hope that we can have that place of production, bringing together, institutionalizing all this reflection and research about how to explore our indigenous system of knowledge and practices. So I thank you very much, all the panelists. Really, I learned a lot from you. It was a very rich conversation. And of course, I thank all the participants who stay even too late, a little bit late, beyond the time. Thank you very much. And I hope that we will have other opportunities to continue this conversation. Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Yes.